With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Every now and then, believe it or not, we actually get hate mail and people ask me questions like, who's the crazy person who told you that you should do a show? Your day has come. Here he be. Our friend Stephen Cont, a longtime friend, really good guy. He's also an author of a book about Star Wars, how the Force can fix the world. We'll talk about that a little bit. But more than that, he has been all over the place. He's got a list of writing credits that anybody would be jealous of. He's great at media stuff. Been kind of a mentor and a good friend to me. Wanted to talk to you for a long time, buddy, because this is kind of your fault. So it's good to finally have you on the show, my friend. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I've heard tell that this show is doing great, and it's nice to be here.
Other than the one episode YouTube clipped for us doing something that we didn't actually do, of all things, you got to love AI. It's doing great, and really appreciate it. I do mean that. Thank you very much for you helping me out with this thing.
I've been there with the YouTube AI censorship before. I was hosting a show last year called Right Now with Stephen Cont, and if you even mentioned COVID-19, you were immediately teed up for some kind of of forcible edit of your content. It was a shocking experience, so I've been there.
Yeah, they jacked us of all the things. And because we deal mostly on the right end of the spectrum, I get my head kicked in for not going along with some of the election conspiracy theories. They took mine down for supporting election conspiracy theories, and we didn't even discuss the election on that episode. So AI was having a bad day. I don't know what happened there, but these sorts of things happen. Let's just start right there, though. Culturally speaking, when we're talking about media, because you are a media expert, you're good at this stuff. I know you talk about it in the book and you talk about it with Star Wars, being stoic. I've gotten a reputation for being a little bit stoic about this stuff. Let me ask you about it, though. Is there such a thing as being too laid back with it? Because I've been accused about that. You're my friend. You know me well. Is there such a thing as being too laid back about the culture and too much of, hey, it is what it is. It's their sandbox. We're playing into it. How do you think we should approach things like that?
Yeah, well, there's absolutely a choice that every one of us needs to make as individuals with how much we are going to engage in the world's problems. What I think that we have a particularly hard challenge of doing these days, though, is really determining which things are within our scope of influence and which things are not. One of the big trials of the mass media market landscape, the internet in general, social media connectivity, is that all things appear to be our problems at all times. When something is going on in Bangladesh, there is going to be some sort of trending topic on Twitter and some sort of hashtag campaign that makes it feel like this is something that you need to be, laser focused on and thinking about for a couple of hours today. And then there are going to be instances where, a major company, right, that's based in the United States, maybe does something that you disagree with. And then you have to decide whether or not this is something that is within your scope of influence. And a lot of people will look at folks who are a little less inclined to engage on issues and go, these people are squishes, or they're cowards. They're not up for the fight. I disregard and don't agree with that line of thinking. I think that we all owe it to ourselves and to our families and people who we love and have only limited emotional bandwidth for, to be very choosy about the things that we get whipped up over. But that does leave us with responsibility for deciding what are the fights worth fighting. There is no clear, easy answer for that. But when you mentioned the Stoic tradition, if you were to boil down Greek and Roman Stoicism into one central idea, it is determining which things are within your control and identifying the things that are not, and worrying less about the things that are not. This is something that is sort of intertwined throughout the Star Wars universe, and the Star Wars moral universe as like its main lesson for its characters is that the dark side is rooted in fear. And that fear, that belief that there are going to be bad things that happen, there are going to be bad people out there who need stopping, that your fear necessitates action. But sometimes that fear is a lie. And so our main task is being able to determine which things are the lies and which things are the fights worth fighting.
Yeah, Stephen Kent joining us. You talked about this on your Substack. It's called This is the Way. That's a Mandalorian reference for those of you from Logan. You were talking about this on your Substack. You actually broke it down into an equation where you were talking about satisfaction and success and failure and making that into almost like a math equation and trying to, how would you say, maybe like get the mix of those three things right so that they come out right. It kind of goes into that tradition, though, isn't it? Is like, well, if you know what satisfies you and you have a set of what a success is, and then you know what a failure is because you didn't reach your success, that kind of gives you a, what do you want to call it, a balance point or a mooring point or a touch point or a GPS point to know where you're at. Because like you said, the media environment now, it's coming at you all the time from all sides, and it wants you to be immersed. That's the word you always hear, is immersed in media. Can something like just a simple equation like that of satisfaction, success, and failure, can that give you kind of a mooring to not get lost in all that?
Yeah, well, that equation fully is credited to Arthur Brooks, formerly of the American Enterprise Institute, and the author of a new book called From Strength to Strength, where he is basically outlining how our kind of consumer hyper-focused attention economy has recategorized happiness as what you have plus what you want plus what you want plus what you want. And basically, it's a never-ending stream of things that you want, and your happiness is never fully achieved. The equation that is offered instead is happiness equals what you have divided by what you want. And so this basically points you in the direction of doing a pretty rigorous audit of the things that you want and being grateful for the things that you have. Happiness is not going to be found necessarily in a bucket list of things that you want to do by the time you die, but more so in thinking about the things that you, I don't know, not that you want to add to the list of the things that you've done, but what are the things that are left undone in your own life that already exist in your scope of influence? Not what are things that you need to go seek out and find to do, but what are things that are like right under your nose that need doing, that you have direct responsibility over?
Yeah, you talk about it that way. One of the other traditions, we talked about the Stoics a little bit. A lot of Star Wars, George Lucas pulled from Japanese culture, specifically the samurai culture, samurai movies. In fact, for the folks that don't know, A New Hope was, we'll be generous and call it an homage to a movie called The Hidden Fortress. It's got a lot of parallels to the great Kurosawa films. In fact, there's that famous picture of Kurosawa on set at The Empire Strikes Back, which is a really cool pop culture reference for folks that get it. The Japanese samurai tradition, not diametrically opposed to the Stoics, their thing was preparedness. You're always prepared to do your duty. And then there was a humility that came of that kind of quiet strength sort of thing. That kind of goes through the Star Wars stuff too. And you wrote about that on This Is the Way also, of one thing we can control, like you talked about before, is our own preparedness. We can't control, war breaks out in Ukraine. We can't control inflation individually, but we can control our preparedness. So when crisis does come up, we have some toolkit stuff to not get overwhelmed by it, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of living in the modern world is feeling perpetually stressed out and burdened by 1,000 inputs coming at you from every direction. And with that does not come empowerment. It really comes a huge creeping sense of powerlessness. One of the things that I had picked up from the Star Wars story, and particularly as a Star Wars fan, very, very simple piece of advice here that is shared by Qui-Gon Jinn in Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, when he's talking to Obi-Wan, and Obi-Wan senses sort of a looming darkness. He has a bad feeling about something, which is a classic Star Wars ism. But he says to keep your mind here and now in the moment where it belongs. And Obi-Wan responds, but Master Yoda said I should be mindful of the future, not at the expense of the moment, is what Qui-Gon responds. And I think that for me has been something that has informed how I try to think think a lot about news consumption. There is a cost to every story you read about war in Ukraine, about war crimes being committed by Russian soldiers. There's a cost to those things. We sort of think about information as this pure, it's neutral. It's like things that we're putting in. It's just data we're consuming, but it doesn't have any sort of cost for us in our day-to-day lives. That's not true. The amount of time that you spend thinking about things going on overseas is time that you are not spending thinking about making sure that your bank account is in order, making sure that you have trimmed certain investments from your portfolio to be more lean and mean for a potentially bad economy. What is the point of watching CNBC and seeing how bad the housing market could get in the next couple of months, unless you are actually calling your mortgage advisor to see about getting a refinance rate? Like, my point here is not to tell you to go buy gold or refinance your mortgage. It is just to say that there is not a neutral cost to inputting a ton of information about things going on around the world. You need to focus on the things that are actionable, and the things that are not lending to you having a better life. They are actually excess and indulgence, and they need to be trimmed from your diet.
Yeah, and there's one of those philosophical things that you find. You find it in the Stoics, you find it in Eastern philosophy as well. As we don't do a real good job, especially as Americans, especially in the current media environment, we don't do a real good job with no. Like, we just don't know how to say no to incoming information, or worse, we get into a rut where all we want is a certain kind of information. Is it, I hate to use this term because it's kind of nebulous, but people talk about mindfulness, but that's really the only term I can think of. Is you have to have a mindfulness of understanding where you're at, because like I've pretty much cut out, even though it's kind of my day job, I've almost completely cut out network news in the US.
Mhm.
I just had to, because I can't do what I need to do and watch that stuff all the time, because it just,
Yeah, I mean, it's kind
all
of
it is.
it's kind of a centerpiece of Star Wars. You hear it in almost every single movie. Someone will say, "Search your feelings," and it's they're saying that because when you have emotional reaction to a thing, a person, somebody makes a joke about your wife, right? Will Smith, the feelings that wash over you are not coming from nowhere. And the right thing to do, the mindful thing to do, is to try to spend time reflecting on the why of those feelings, what is informing where that thing is coming from. Um, I think probably with Star Wars, the main thing that characters deal with in that book, or in those movies, and I write about a lot in my book, is the fear of loss. So you have Anakin Skywalker, who becomes Darth Vader, primarily is motivated by a fear of loss. He has bad dreams about losing people that he loves, and he wants to try to take certain actions to stop that from happening. Yoda, in a great scene in episode 3, tells him that he needs to focus on his attachments and learn to be okay with letting go, learn to let go of all that he fears to lose. That is nice advice, but it's actually not very practical. It would be much more practical. It would be much more practical for someone like Anakin to sit down with a medically licensed professional to actually talk to him about his really awful childhood where he was a slave, right? He grew up on Tatooine in slavery, living a life where he had no autonomy, no ability to make choices. Every choice was made for him. His entire existence was sort of marred by his agency being completely taken away. And as an adult, go figure, he's obsessed with agency. He's obsessed with always being able to make sure that if something bad is going to happen, or there's a possibility of something bad happening, that he has the ability to stop it. That doesn't come from nowhere. Someone like him needs to be mindful of his feelings and mindful of where he came from to inform who he is today. We all have to do that in our own lives and try to account for, why do we feel the way that we feel when we read a certain story, or we have a debate with our aunt or our uncle who's politically different than us? Why does it agitate us when they disagree with us or say something wild and out there?
Yeah, talking to Stephen Kent. Yeah, even in a galaxy far, far away, a whole lot of the bad universe revolves around daddy issues. Who would have thought it? We're continuing with Stephen Kent. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more Star Wars, a little more philosophy. No way around it. Star Wars is owned by Disney. Disney's all over the news. So we'll see if any of this philosophy stuff will apply to that hot mess that's going on. Stephen Kent, our good friend, continues with us on Heard Tell right after. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Enjoying talking to my friend Stephen Kent. He's here. He is the author of How the Force Can Fix the World, Lessons on Life, Liberty, and Happiness from a Galaxy Far, Far Away. My copy's right there. It was pretty cool going in a bookstore with the kids and saying, hey, I know that book. I know the guy that wrote it. And the kids like the book too, by the way. It's great. Pick it up and read it. Okay, so you wrote that. You held up Star Wars as an example of here's some good philosophical stuff. Everybody loves Star Wars. We know the parent company of Star Wars that owns it now is famously Disney, for good and ill. I think more good than people really give it credit for. I think overall they're doing a decent job with it. But Disney, the parent company, is all over the news now for cultural issues. It's not the first time. You tell me, because you wrote a book saying, hey, here's something I want to hold up as a standard, and then something that's related to it comes out in the news like that. That's got to be a little awkward to have to navigate, doesn't it?
Honestly, it is a little bit awkward, and it's kind of one of those externalities that you can't really anticipate in life when you're writing a book sort of talking about the relatively timeless virtues of a story like Star Wars that has been around with us for 40 plus years, since 1977, was, existed independently under George Lucas and Lucasfilm for a long time before being purchased by Disney and sort of put into their list of offerings. But I guess in living sort of the main virtues of the book, you can't focus too much on the things that are not within your control. Look, it's not a great situation for Disney to be participating in the polarization of America. We've got a major issue going on right now where essentially now even America's internet is starting to split along political lines. A couple internet theorists that I follow have been calling this the splinternet, just a complete breakup of the ecosystems that we all operate and live in. And Disney, by and large, has existed in the ecosystem for 50 plus years as a media company designed to appeal to the average median American. But the splinternet does not appeal to the average median American. The splinternet and all these different sort of trends where media companies are going for targeted niche ideological audiences is not about trying to bring together as many people under one tent as possible. It's about segmentation. I'm worried that Star Wars could absolutely fall into that category, given enough time and given enough ideological meddling by creators within the Disney Corporation, that this story, which is transcended 4 generations, or woven together 4 generations of fans with shared values and like a really cool, just like theologically driven, philosophical story, could be marred by identity politics and sort of the red versus blue flame war that we see playing out on TV every single day.
Let me bring it to you this way, because Star Wars has changed. Because you think about 77, this big blockbuster movie really wasn't a thing. Jaws and Star Wars, those were kind of the first couple of real blockbuster movies. It kind of made its own path. I'm one of those tweeners. I vaguely remember the original movies. We mostly watched them on cable reruns. I came to learn Star Wars through the books before the episode 1, before we had this thing called the internet back in the 90s, the dark ages, folks probably thought it was. So I learned to love it through the books. I went to episode 1, 2, and 3 in the theater as a young adult. I was 19, 20 years old, working a summer camp. We all got the night off and all went together. I remember going to episode 1 in the theater. It's like, we're going to get to see Star Wars in the theater because we were too young to do that. And I got to do what I never thought I was going to do. I got to go to episode 7 with my kids. And I got to sit in a theater and watch a Star Wars film with my kids, who were teenagers by that time. I don't know. Isn't part of the story here that Star Wars has changed and adapted The internet world, we did away with the books. That got pushed to the side. The way movies have changed now, you don't really have the big blockbusters now because they split time. They come out straight on things. You have the Disney streaming series. Isn't part of this is just Star Wars is such a big thing that it's going to have to adapt to culture. And I don't mean the cultural debate. I just mean the way culture works now. They do seem to be adapting it somewhat with the serials and things like this as well, because they made a major turn away from the movies and focused on these serials, and the series have been really, really good.
Yeah, I mean, Star Wars Lucasfilm is absolutely playing in sort of an a la carte approach to media, recognizing that in the streaming environment, there are not as many large cultural events in the modern world that we're going to share in theaters and on couches across the country at one single time. There's not going to be many of these moments where a TV show has a finale and 60+% of the country is all sitting on their couches at the same time watching. That just doesn't happen anymore. And the same is absolutely the case when it comes to what's playing in the movie theaters. Star Wars has come out as sort of an interesting time for Disney, where they tried to do a sequel trilogy, episodes 7, 8, and 9. And you can say that they performed financially fine. By and large, they did what blockbuster movies are supposed to do, which is bring in several, tens of millions of dollars. But you can look at the cultural impact that those movies and say that it has declined. What has not had that sort of mediocre, lukewarm cultural impact has been their streaming shows. Like The Mandalorian is the prime example of a Star Wars Disney-run TV series that has changed the game, made a cultural impact, and put a Baby Yoda bumper sticker on almost every car in America. That's what Star Wars does. That's what Star Wars is supposed to be all about. But as soon as you continue to segment your audiences, you're going to sort of have some less impact over time. The next thing up in Disney's offerings is the Obi-Wan Kenobi show on Disney Plus. Previously, most people were purely excited about that show. But now what the culture wars have given us in the form of, kind of another round of conservative boycotts against Disney Plus is this sort of contention that these major companies, these major media corporations are basically asking you to stomach the kind of reprehensible, like far left, very progressive and radical ideas that they put into shows for young children, and at the same time accept that because they're going to also offer good programming for the mass public in the form of an Obi-Wan Kenobi show or the next Avengers series. That's a real choice that you have to make. How much do you accommodate things that you find to be reprehensible with things that you find to be obviously good? I think it is the individual responsibility of every person in your audience to sort of gut check what matters most to them. Do you want to be able to watch Obi-Wan while also walling off other programs that your children might watch? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But I do understand why people find that to be such a tense, personal and moral conflict.
Yeah, because we've talked about it when the business model is audience capture, and we've talked about it on this program a lot because that's how the news media works now. They work towards audience capture. It's tough for people to say because they feel like everybody feels like they own Star Wars because they're so invested in it. It's like you and me, we've had Star Wars all of our lives. And we want our kids.
They do,
to have it.
and we are in many ways like owners of this story. I mean, this story, this franchise, is not like Marvel. Marvel does outperform it at the box office. It outperforms it in streaming and in merchandising sales with younger generations. But Marvel has never been like Star Wars as a property, where it is almost this sort of mythological tale that is shared within families and in households, where the figures, like the characters of Star Wars, they exist in a completely other realm. People do not talk about Thanos the way that they talk about Darth Vader. Thanos does not have the kind of pop cultural relevance, as the dark side entity that exists inside of all of us, as does any of the Sith characters in Star Wars. Star Wars is just different. they need to protect that. They need to protect and be incredibly coveting of that responsibility to handle that IP. I mean, George Lucas handed it over a little reluctantly because he did feel that Disney was the best place for that to live. I guess I sympathize with people who feel like they cannot trust it to be handled with that kind of care so that it is for everybody, because Star Wars is something that does live inside the consumers and the fans. You mentioned the dissolution of the books. That was kind of one thing that disenchanted a lot of fans early on in Disney's acquisition, was that the books were kind of removed from canonical legend and moved into a specific category called legends. I am of the mind that this was an overreaction by fans because the Star Wars expanded universe, the extended universe stories, it was like anarchy. It was like fans writing fan fiction, getting published deals, and then sort of having their books out there as possible futures and possible stories within Star Wars. I feel like all Disney did was clean up what was canon and what was not. But I understand that the central appeal to Star Wars is that it sort of lives with the fans to decide certain things about what happens in the future of the story.
Yeah, well, there was some fan fiction, but a lot of that Timothy Zahn stuff keeps showing up in the different stuff in the Clone Wars episodes.
They're canonizing it. They're borrowing it. And
yeah.
they rehired Timothy Zahn. They had Timothy Zahn come back in and rewrite the Thrawn trilogy. Yeah. But they had Timothy Zahn write it so that it fits into their other TV shows and movies. And that's better. We should want Thrawn to be involved, like as a major character from the old books. We should want Thrawn to be involved in the Mandalorian series and in the animated shows. But to do that, you have to set the record straight on what is the canonical timeline for the Thrawn story. So I thought it was like the right way to balance that by saying, look, the old Thrawn stories are great inspiration for this character, but we're going to have Timothy Zahn come back in and rewrite when Thrawn's story happens and what the details are of it.
Yeah, and I'm a huge fan of the Thrawn, the Heir to the Empire trilogy. If you've never read it, you don't have to be a Star Wars fan. It's widely regarded really high-end science fiction. It's excellent stuff. Go read it on your own. But I'm glad they brought Thrawn back because I'm one of those guys. I fell in love with the Star Wars, not from the original movies, but from the books. So I'm one of them. We could talk this all day, but I got to let you go. Stephen Kent, good friend of ours. I've appreciated your friendship. Let folks know where they can follow you on your social media and what else you have going on until we get you back on the show again. And we're not going to take 8 months to do it this time, I promise.
Yeah. Best way to get in touch with me is to find me on Twitter at Steven_Kent89 and go out and pick up my book, How the Force Can Fix the World, Lessons on Life, Liberty, and Happiness from a Galaxy Far, Far Away.
Yep. I got it right here for the YouTube audience. My friend, you do great work. I appreciate your time. Let's have you back soon, my friend.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks.